Desiree, thank you. Our speaker today is Cahlan Sharp. Cahlan spent his formative years in a small town in Nevada, coming to Provo after serving an LDS mission to Brazil, and he attended school at BYU. After some defining moments in his educational experience, he spent some time teaching himself web development and started a career as a web developer. Soon after, he fell into the startup world and spent the next 10 years starting, building, and failing, he says. As you learned, right? So you didn't fail, right? So fail at creating a successful and impactful business. In early 2013, after moving back to Utah following the failure of a Silicon Valley tech startup, he decided to start teaching part-time coding classes. These classes became Dev Mountain, the largest and highest-rated coding school in the Intermountain West, and one of the most successful coding schools in the country. Cahlan is a husband to a beautiful and talented wife and father to 4 children. He enjoys technology, particularly development, golf, and being an armchair quarterback. Maybe he'll tell us all about that. If you'll please join me this afternoon in welcoming Cahlan Sharp to our lecture series.
Thank you. I'm going to try to pull up my presentation here. And it sounds like from your lineup of speakers coming up that you probably came a week too early. You probably should have waited till next week to really... Sorry, I forgot I have to log in here. If I can remember my password. Maybe. No, not that one. Changed about 4 years ago. So there we go. That's the one. Okay. Sorry I was a little late today. I was on my way back from Park City, and it's a little bit of a drive, and it stopped by my house and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk to you today about something I feel like I've learned a little bit about in my time as a startup entrepreneur, as a web developer, and just in business in general. There's probably lots of I know there are great books out there that you can read that will probably tell you a lot more about what I'm going to talk about than what I will say, but hopefully something I say or a question you ask that I can answer will give you some guidance or some turn on a light bulb or two for you in your life and in your upcoming career. So as was said, I started Dev Mountain a few years ago. Maybe I'll just go through this slide really quickly. Most of this was already covered. I think the failure part is really, really important because we have this saying in kind of the startup world called fail fast, right? So I don't know if I failed fast enough in 10 years. Maybe I should have failed more quickly, but you definitely, I can say with 100% honesty that I probably learned more in the failures that I experienced than I did in the successes that I experienced. And we can talk more about that. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So yeah, that's me. This icon is kind of cool. I didn't spend a bunch of time creating that for myself. I'm not that kind of a person, but I have a really good friend who's like an amazing artist, web, graphic designer type person, and he made this for my birthday recently. And I just thought it was the coolest thing that I've like the coolest birthday present I've ever received. So I just like it. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about my least favorite word that I hear in business, and that word is synergy. How many of you have heard this word thrown around a lot? Synergy. Okay, so synergy has you've heard of the term jump the shark. Have you ever heard of that term before? Jump the shark? Who can explain what jump the shark means? What's the background behind that phrase?
It comes from Happy Days,
Uh-huh.
the TV show. The show's ratings were starting to fail. They needed to do something crazy to bring the ratings back up. And so the idea was, we'll put the Fonz on jet skis and literally make him jump over a shark. And so now today we use the phrase jumping the shark to mean you got to do something crazy in order to make this successful.
Excellent. Or it kind of means or it kind of means okay, we finally passed the point where this thing is even credible anymore. We've kind of just we've passed that line where suddenly Happy Days is just silly and ridiculous. It's no longer, I don't know if it was ever credible, but you know what I mean. So I don't know at what point the term synergy jumped the shark, but I don't know. Maybe it was in a presentation somewhere, or it just kind of fell into the standard vocabulary of every business development person. But I just hear it all the time, and in these really weird contexts. So I just did a search yesterday on my email just for the word synergy and pulled out the most ridiculous uses of the word synergy I could find. So the top one here, if you can't read it, how about having a short call to see if we can find a synergy? So I don't a synergy. are like, okay, singular synergy. The second one says, I'd like to walk you through our successes with businesses like yours and understand the possibility of a synergy to support each other. Okay? Synergy used to support. Okay, all right. And the last one is probably the best one. I am sure that synergy will deliver good business results. So it's, as you can see, like in my mind, the term synergy has kind of jumped the shark to the point where it's just thrown around and used in all kinds of contexts and situations where it's probably not appropriate or even relevant. I kind of think that a lot of times synergy has just become a replacement for words like relationship or agreement or even partnership, energy, compatibility. Like people just use the word synergy because it sounds more exciting, or I don't know, maybe it makes you sound more fluent in the business world. I don't know. But it's just kind of reached this stage where synergy is kind of this ridiculous word to me. But I think the concept behind synergy is really still a very powerful one. And really, if you want to boil it down to kind of its basic elements, it's really just that a group of things or a set of things can be greater than the individual contributors of that thing, right? So the sum is greater than the parts. That's kind of the base definition that I use for synergy when I'm trying to see if I'm using it in the right context or not. Am I trying to define something where parts are equaling a greater output than the inputs, or or am I using it just to sound smart or neat or something like that? And why does that matter? So I think these words like synergy, culture, creativity, they're kind of a description of like an output or a result more than they are a description of an input, if that makes sense. You can't necessarily like put somebody in a room and say, okay, ready, be creative, go. Or like innovate, ready, 1, 2, 3, innovate, and synergy is definitely not that. We're like, okay, I even put this little funny slide here, like synergize, let's do this. All right, guys, let's synergize. They're kind of a description of something as a result that you hope for, but they're not really something that you can prescribe and say, okay, now everybody, we're going to be creative, innovative, and we're going to have a lot of synergy. All right, let's go. It's more of a description of an output or what results from your efforts than it is a prescription of how you're going to get there. So I'm just going to share some thoughts with you today about creating a culture. And remember, these words like culture, creativity, innovation, I think they're kind of describing an output more than they are an input. But I'm going to try to describe the best I can what I think the inputs are for trying to create this environment where creativity and innovation and even synergy like are the norm, or they're a part of who you are as an organization. And this could be in a startup, it could be in a class, it could be in an organization, it could be in a subunit of an organization, a team. It could be in a lot of different contexts. So hopefully that's relevant to you in your life and what you're working on right now. Okay, so culture, a lot like creativity, is not necessarily what we say it is. And what do I mean by that? You've probably heard this term company culture thrown around, I would assume, just in life. I was actually just looking this morning because I remembered this funny part that I'd read. In fact, I put it up on my phone so I could read it to you. We might say that culture is one thing, but what it actually is sometimes very different. So I was just reading this morning Enron's annual report to its shareholders in the year 2000 and what their company values were at that time. Their stated company values, right? They included communication, respect, integrity, and excellence, okay? So on paper, these guys were outstanding, full of integrity, honest people, but in reality, their culture was something very, very different than what they said it was, right? There are certain things we can do to try to enforce and direct the way that our company culture goes, or your organizational culture, but really it's a manifestation of what you actually do and what you actually are, more so than what you say you are, if that makes sense. I pulled up a couple of examples of culture that I've looked at and have learned a lot from over the years, and wanted to talk with you about why they chose these particular values or these kind of tenets of their culture. So in Netflix, one of their big things is they want to create a dream team, and they're really, really focused on hiring and retaining only the most excellent people that they can possibly find. So in fact, in one of the earlier versions of their company culture, they talked about like if somebody was like an adequate performer, those people deserved a severance package in their mind. Like, we don't keep like average people or adequate people. We keep only the excellent, high-performing people. Now, that sounds like a very challenging culture to thrive in. It sounds a little bit cutthroat. But can you imagine why Netflix would want a value like that, would want to enforce that kind of principle? Anybody? Any thoughts? What do you think? Yeah, I mean, they're in an industry where they're going up against these giants in the entertainment industry. They're trying to disrupt. I mean, they have very little to work with, right? They've got to create something in the industry. It's very difficult. Yeah.
If you want to create a culture that's going to be sustainable over a period of time, you kind of got to do that.
Yeah.
It's those average, mediocre, or less than mediocre people. They're going to be pulling people down. They'll help.
Yeah, that's the way they viewed it. Absolutely. Now, of course, the terms adequate, high perform, those are all relative terms, and each organization might have different definitions for what that means and different traits that they emphasize in that, evaluation of if somebody is excellent or if somebody's average. But I think that's an interesting trait that they looked at. They also wanted to be extraordinarily candid with each other. Now, in your experience in school, business, life, whatever, why do you think that would be an important trait for you to emphasize in your company culture? Being candid with one another. Can you think of a time? Okay, go ahead.
Just say a lot of time in corporations, there's a lot of backstabbing, a lot of just gossip, a lot of rumor mill. Just no one never
Yeah.
says it straight out and wastes a lot of time, energy.
Absolutely. I'm sure we've all experienced times where backbiting or gossiping or whatever has caused damage. Yeah.
People will protect each other's bad ideas if they're like a person and not the idea.
That's exactly right. How many of you in here enjoy conflict? I don't. I avoid conflict at all costs, and it's something that I have to constantly reinforce and train myself to do, to rather than avoid conflict for a later time when it seems like it might be more convenient, or just kind of brush it under the rug, to embrace it early, because it actually only gets worse over time, right? And that includes in my life, it includes pretty much everything. It includes family, it includes relationships with other people, it includes business. I've learned to get better at embracing conflict, or at least addressing it head on, rather than kind of trying to weave around it, because it causes major problems sometimes. If you're in a meeting with somebody and somebody brings up a really bad idea, at least in your mind it's a bad idea, you might be hesitant to say, I don't think this is a good idea, because you don't want to hurt that person's feelings, right? Maybe they're a colleague of yours, maybe they're a friend of yours, maybe they're your boss, right? Like, there's all kinds of reasons why you might want to avoid that particular conflict. However, according to Netflix anyway, being candid in those conversations can be very, very empowering. There was one other hand back here. I don't want to. Yeah.
It was pretty much the same thing, but I think we have this idea of brainstorming as don't criticize.
Mm.
And that's the wrong way to do brainstorming. I think
Yeah.
don't gossip, don't attack personally, but we need to criticize ideas. Otherwise, we protect bad ideas and they end up moving into production.
Okay. Yeah. Great point. So, might seem like a little bit counterintuitive, but how would this candidness help creativity and innovation? This is kind of off of what you were just saying. If we're not afraid to be candid with each other, how is that going to help us be more creative and innovative?
Doesn't opposition stimulate creativity?
I think in a lot of ways it does. We're going to get to that in a moment. Yeah.
I think especially if you're candid with someone about the job expectations that we're hiring, especially that's, and this is the expectation, it gives them ownership
Yeah.
over their creativity.
Yeah.
So I know what's expected of me, I know what I'm expected to perform, and I'm gonna rise to that level. When you're not being candid about what the expectations are, it's hard to be creative, it's hard to know where your boundaries are, or how much is enough.
Well, and let me take that a step further. If somebody is underperforming to their potential, you know that they are much better than what they are doing, and you sit them down and you say, look, I know you are talented, I know you have potential, I need you to step it up. How much does that help reinforce that process, right? Yeah.
Yeah, candidness in culture, I think it makes teams fail faster and allowing you to innovate more quickly.
Yeah, I was just thinking of an example where, as an early web developer, I would take on these freelance projects, and I got very used to early on just saying yes to whatever the client wanted me to do, because they were the client, they were the one writing the checks, right? So if they asked me to build something that I thought was a terribly awful idea, I would just say, okay, I'll build it, and then charge them for it. Ultimately, that was not a good idea, because in that case, I couldn't help them be creative or innovative if I knew their end product was going to fail, right, in some way or another. So helping them understand where they were heading off a cliff was an important thing too. Yeah, back there.
So, as well, for the first
Well, yeah, and it's a good point, and I think it's important also to recognize that criticism, unbridled criticism, isn't necessarily, a good, precursor to creativity or innovation, because it actually can have the opposite effect, right? If you're constantly criticizing somebody, or maybe you're managing somebody and you're saying, I don't like this, I don't like that, then they're just going to learn to do whatever you think that they're going to learn to do or produce whatever they think you think wants to be produced, right? So they're just going to kind of, do whatever you want. They're going to be a people pleaser. So a couple of, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's some others that are interesting to just kind of think about, noodle around in your head. Netflix proactively avoids creating creating procedures or rules, right? So that's one of their core tenets, is that they believe that people should be empowered, they should be free, and that's going to include making mistakes sometimes. Now, obviously, they don't want mistakes including like huge financial repercussions that sink the company, those kinds of mistakes, so they're going to guard against those big mistakes. But when it comes to everyday mistakes, if you read through their stuff, it's really interesting. But companies do, as they get bigger and bigger, they tend to institute and incorporate more rules and procedures, just because they're trying to keep things tight and eliminate variability and stuff like that. And Netflix's argument in that is that you actually reduce people's ability to be creative the more kind of rules and procedures you just put upon them. And independent decision making, also very important. Okay, let's jump to the next one. So Zappos, and if you want to read a really good book about culture, Tony Hsieh, who was the CEO of Zappos, wrote a book called Delivering Happiness that is probably one of the best books on company culture that I've personally read. He talks about the backstory of Zappos and all they learned about their company culture. Really interesting case study. Some of their company culture is embrace and drive change, which I think that's kind of something we'd all probably hope for. I guess it depends on what organization you're in. Maybe if you're in a government organization or something, maybe that's not the goal, or a bunch of accounts or something, I don't know. But being fun and a little weird is kind of interesting. Like they want, when they interview people to work at Zappos, they want to not only know that they are really skilled and have talent in what they're looking for, but they also want to know, like, what quirks do you have? Like, what kind of interesting things or hobbies do you do that make you unique, that give you a little bit more personality? That's one of their core things. They want people to be a little bit weird along with fun. Do more with less. We're going to talk about constraints in a minute. I think that's an important piece of this. And then be adventurous and open-minded. So we could probably talk for a long time about these. Any on this list that stick out to you or that you think are particularly important to create a culture of innovation and creativity for Zappos? Any that kind of speak to you that you've had experience with? That's okay. You don't have to have any. You don't have to have any answers. We can move on. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So one of the books I was just reading was talking about how to make people feel like they belong. People feel like they belong when they're part of a small group, and then that smaller group participates in a much larger group.
Okay.
And so I think having people that are fun and a little bit weird, you can get people together who all feel like they're just a little bit different, and they can participate in that like smaller identity, but then also participate in the larger corporate identity. And they'll feel like they belong. People feel like they belong and they're like cared for. Then that's an environment where you can be creative.
Very cool. I like that. There's another hand. Yes.
Yes, I found in my own business that being open-minded, especially to the customer, right? Some things that maybe your team hadn't thought of, or being willing to go try something like that, adventurous in that case.
Yeah.
That leads to a lot of success.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally agree. Yes.
I'm a little weird, but I'd say that all of us, in many ways, have our own have a weirdness. But often at work, we feel like it's something we don't bring up because it's a distraction or it's something that's not work related. But if you only ever think of your coworkers as coworkers, and you never know them on that level, where you know what their weirdness or quirks are. I often feel like from the last slide, I can't be candid. I can't be open. I can't talk about anything and everything that comes to mind, truly brainstorm, if I don't know them and they don't know me at that level. Because then when I'm sarcastic or make an off-the-wall comment, I'm worried that it's going to offend or detract, or instead of them understanding that that's me,
Yeah.
and us continuing to work in that environment.
Yeah. I really like that. I really like that thought. We all, if you think about it, we're all a little bit weird in some way, right? And so it's not necessarily like encouraging people to go find weird things. It's more just embracing people for who they are, and kind of welcoming that with open arms, rather than, okay, leave your humanity at the door. When you come in the door, you're going to be, a cog in a wheel. that kind of treating people more like humans, less like machine parts, is an interesting piece of creativity and innovation. Yeah.
I'm wondering how accurate these cultural statements are, and do they practice? So I'm thinking about Zappos here. Embrace and drive change. Maybe Zappos. I don't see them. Are they driving change in that world of this online market? So I'm wondering, can you speak to, or do you have any examples of what they've done to do more with less? Like, how are they doing that? And are cultures really representative of what they're doing? Like, your Enron example is great. They
Yeah.
weren't doing that.
Right.
These guys are really doing it.
Yeah, I think, Zappos was acquired by Amazon after the book was written and after this kind of became a really big thing. So I'm sure their kind of explicit culture, or I guess their culture that actually exists versus what they say, maybe that's changed. I really don't know. I haven't walked the halls of Zappos recently. But at least according to their book and the anecdotes that you read about their company, they did do a lot with less early on. That's kind of how they got to the point that they were at. They were able to be adventurous in an industry that wasn't doing super well. They were able to use something, customer service, which is always looked at as like, oh, this thing that we don't want to mess with, let's offshore it. They embrace that as like one of their big values. Delivering happiness is a lot about having the customer be delighted with their interaction with you, and so they really embraced this whole customer service side of the business and made it like kind of one of their core. It's not value, but like. Actually, one of their core kind of value statements is something to the effect of delivering happiness through like wowing the customer is what a big thing that they focused on, and so they became known as this great example of customer service in an industry that had traditionally like outsourced all customer service because they just didn't want to handle it. So I would say that I think that yes, they have demonstrated this. I don't know about recent history, but definitely up until a certain point, I would say that they have. All right. So some interesting examples there to get you thinking about, company culture and how companies try to define culture, or at least, portray it to the outside world. For me personally, this is like where it changes to like my ideas, and you can take notes, and or you can just like think that I'm blowing smoke or something. But when I think about culture and what I've experienced with culture, the elements that I think to create a good company culture that fosters innovation, creativity, and even results in this synergistic, environment, are people, environment, direction, and constraint. So I'm going to give you some quick examples of each of these, and I'm going to talk in the end about how one of the companies that I worked with, that I started, Dev Mountain, we kind of came across each one of these attributes as we built our culture. Okay, so when we talk about people, we're talking about kind of this a little bit of that Netflix thing, right? Like, what kind of people are you hiring? If you're hiring people that have the right talents and skills and potential, and there's this like really amorphous like culture fit word, right? Like, do they fit in with the rest of the group? Are they a natural extension of who we are and who we want to become, or are they rather people that are very, very different than what we espouse to be? And I'll give you an example of this. We hired we kind of hired somebody who was pretty much outside of our normal typical person that we would hire. They had attributes, they had some characteristics, maybe even some tendencies that were, a little bit beyond what we were comfortable with, and not like in a immoral way or anything like that. It was just they kind of went against the grain in a lot of ways, which can be very good, right? If you're trying to hire somebody for a competency that you don't currently possess, and you may have to go outside your company's comfort zone to find that person, right? But in this particular case, this person, the decisions they started making, the conversations they were having, the relationships they were building or failing to build, caused a lot of problems inside the company, right? So it was pretty quick. We kind of identified this. After a while, it kind of became clear that it was almost like we were this system, this biological system, and this foreign agent had been introduced, and like the white blood cells were like attacking, and nobody could like handle the way this person was doing business, the kind of decisions they were making, the kind of conversations they were having, and it just became clear that like this person was not going to be successful in our organization, not because they were a terrible person, but because they just didn't fit our values and the kinds of people that we were looking to hire. So all of that wrapped up, the kind of people you hire absolutely have an effect on your culture, right? In fact, if you fail to define your culture, let's say you're a company of 1 to 2 people, then your culture is defined by the two of you in a room, right? But as you hire 50 or 100 people, your culture is defined by the aggregate of that group. And that could be good if you hire really amazing, talented people that just fall in line and know exactly what they're supposed to do. Or it could be bad if you're no longer in charge of hiring and you're hiring people who are hiring people who are hiring people. You're hoping that they're hiring those good people, right? And if they're not, your company culture is changing, whether or not you know it. So people is a really important part of that equation. Number 2, environment. I think this is everything from the space that you work in, along with the values that you espouse and the procedures that you put in place. Yes, Dr. Graham.
Curious about your last slide. You're talking about that. So do you feel like you hire culture, or that you build culture, or?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's both. I think you have to be very deliberate about it. The answer that I would give is you have to be deliberate about it. You have to say, who are we? Like, statically right now, who are we? And who do we want to become? And then you have to hire based on those two things, right? Do we hire somebody who fits into the best of what we are and continues to enhance that? Or do we hire somebody who's going to push us in this particular direction where we want to be a little bit better? That's what I would say. Yeah.
One thing I'm wondering about, in your experience with Dead Mountain, was culture something you were thinking about from the beginning, or was it like later on?
No, I've heard this from a lot of people, but it becomes really apparent when you get past a certain size where you're not hiring everybody anymore. Culture is pretty easy to manage when you are the person hiring everybody. So in the early days, when I hired like the first 10 people, there's almost like an unspoken, like, I care so much, and I have these values kind of internally. They're all kind of swashing around in my brain. So when I meet somebody, I kind of have a pretty good sixth sense of whether or not they fit into our vision. And that's because I started the company, right? But then when somebody else in the company who maybe isn't as invested, or maybe isn't as passionate, or maybe doesn't think about the same things that you do, they're hiring people, you're now 1 degree removed from the people that are coming in the company that are defining how your company is going to act and operate, right? So there came a moment for me where I realized, like, if we didn't sit down and at least as a group define who we were and who we wanted to become, it was going to get defined for us, and maybe not in a good way. So I've heard a few people say that same thing, where they got to a point in their company where they were like, wow, I don't even know the new people that are walking in the door. I've never even met these new employees before. They're employees of our company, and I don't know. Tony Hsieh talks about this in the Zappos book. He talks about an earlier company he started, and it got to the point where he was walking through the office and he didn't recognize anybody anymore. He didn't know the people that he was working with, and the culture had changed and he hadn't even known it. In his mind, the company was still all about one thing, but the aggregate, the group, really was acting in a very different way than he thought they should act. And so the culture kind of got away from him and caused some problems for him. But, yeah.
Follow-up question. So when it sounds like at the beginning, the culture was kind of defined by your kind of tacit whatever you had.
Well, it's you, right? You are the culture, yeah.
Yeah. And then as it grew and you like started explicitly talking about it, did you find that it shifted, or was it more just saying, oh no, we just want to keep how we've been doing it?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. So it was kind of an opportunity for us to state the best of what we were good at. How did we get here? Well, what characteristics have made us successful? Well, it was because of this, this, and this. And what has changed for good? Like, what things have we learned along the way that we need to be more, we need to be more active in, or attributes that we need to try to value more, or those kinds of things. So it's kind of like the answer to Dr. Graham's question. It's kind of both. You're kind of saying, what's the best of what we are, and what do we aspire to become? And for that reason, I think culture, and especially when you're trying to define culture with your company, it needs to be an ongoing conversation. It's not a static 10 commandments that are written on stone and carved in marble in your lobby. They need to be constantly kind of readdressing and evaluating based on experiences, based on things your company is going through. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both.
I was just thinking about that too, and somehow allowing the employees that are hired on to have a voice in what culture becomes.
Yeah.
How it's evolving, because if it's just what Cahlan wants the culture to be, that could be good, but it could
Yeah.
also be not. It might also not meet the needs of everyone else that is coming into the organization.
That's right.
There's a tension there, a balance
Yeah.
that needs to be.
Well, and those new employees that are coming in that haven't worked with you or with a small group for years, they also have sometimes the best perspective about what makes you good, because you can't necessarily always define why are we successful, what makes us who we are. I don't really know. We've just kind of done it. And some of our best conversations around culture came from the newcomers who were like, I really loved it when this happened, and this person did this. That surprised me. And we're like, yeah, that is kind of cool. I guess that isn't very normal. Let's write that down, So that's a really good point. Okay, so environment, we're going to talk more about in the kind of examples of Dev Mountain, but, defining your environment has a lot to do with your creativity. If you take a really, artistic person and put them in like a basement with just cement walls and say, okay, make a beautiful piece of art, maybe they'll be successful, but environment has a lot to do with humans and how they operate and how they work effectively. Light, natural light, has a lot to do with that. There's lots of studies you could read on, everything from the chair you sit in to the kind of way your office space is formatted, cubicles versus open space, distractions, all that kind of stuff plays into your environment. So it's something you need to be considering. Okay, third thing is direction, and I think we've covered this actually pretty well so far. Kind of defining or stating who we are as an organization and who do we want to become. So it's an acknowledgement of the best part of who you are to this point, but then also aspiring to something greater, or at least extending the values that you most aspire to beyond, and kind of how can we continue going down that road. And then finally, constraint. Somebody mentioned this earlier, but constraint can actually encourage creativity. There's this idea of paralysis of choice, where if you're just kind of given a blank piece of paper and said, okay, write a novel, you just kind of sit there with writer's block because you're like, where do I start? What do I do? So there was this example that I read about the other day where, somebody had gone around to different, notable people and asked them to write like it was like a 6-word biography or something like that, and each person had to write like 6 words that described their whole life, right? And so they came up with these really amazingly funny, creative, poignant phrases that kind of describe their entire career. I think Stephen Colbert wrote something like, well, at least I thought I was funny, or something. That was like his, like 6-word bio. Maybe that wasn't 6 words. I don't know, how many words it was. But it's interesting how sometimes constraints can inspire creativity. We'll talk more about that in a second. A lot of times constraints can be hidden advantages. This is one thing that Zappos talked about, was what things about us and our constraints actually we can turn into advantages. And this is something they did with customer service, right? They found themselves dealing with customer service a lot because online ordering and shopping and returns and all that kind of stuff was a huge issue. And so they said, okay, this is something that might be looked at as a disadvantage. How can we turn it into an advantage? How can we make customer service the thing that we really, really, really excel at? And I'll tell you about some stuff that we did at Dev Mountain too that I felt like helped our creativity. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one of those now, just kind of with a case study in Dev Mountain, talk about what I learned in this last company and how we kind of caught onto this. So when it came to people, and again, this was something that we kind of defined over time. It wasn't like a lot of times people ask me, okay, when you were writing the business plan of Dev Mountain and blah blah blah, and I say, wait, I never wrote a business plan. I never sat down and wrote like a 5-year plan of what we were going to become. I just started teaching classes, and then everything just kind of started happening very, very quickly. So I never really had time to sit down and make this like 5-year plan. But as we kind of started getting better at defining who we were and who we wanted to become, somebody asked me one time, if you were to define your company culture in 2 words, what would those 2 words be? And I said, we care. That's like the one thing that I would want everybody in our company to believe and espouse and to live, is that we care about what we do, we care about the people that we serve, all of that kind of stuff. And so I can say honestly that when I would interview people early on, when I was hiring people, that was a big thing that I was looking for, is that they needed to have a connection to education beyond just, oh, this sounds like a fun thing, or oh, this pays well, or whatever. It needed to be something, I wanted to feel kind of a burning desire inside of them to teach or to give back or to share. And that went for not only teachers, but it eventually became true for even the finance people that we worked with, the people that created new curriculum, to the extent that those people really cared about what we were trying to do and the people that we were serving, I feel like they were dramatically more effective and more innovative and creative than just because it was a great job and because they fit the resume bullet points that we were looking for. When it came to environment, this picture is not very easy to see. I probably should have made it a lot bigger. But we always tried to create an environment. This is more kind of student and staff, but we wanted to create an environment where people felt they felt comfortable and they felt, well, I guess I'll say it this way. We wanted to create for students an environment that felt a lot like where they were going to be working, hopefully in 3 to 6 months. So we wanted it to feel like a tech company. We wanted to feel like a place where they could come and work really hard, but then they could also, go take a break and play the Wii for a few minutes or something like that. And part of that was because we put our students through a lot, and we really kind of put them in the pressure cooker. A lot of them are really being challenged for the first time in their lives academically, truly challenged to the point where they feel like they can't. We want them to. The phrase we use a lot is, we want you to feel like you're almost drowning, but like barely treading water. That's what we tell them. And it's very much by design that we want them to feel that way. But we want the environment to be conducive to them to not feel like they're being suffocated, right? We want the educational experience to be really difficult, but we want the environment to be welcoming, to be relaxing. So we're kind of trying to combat those two different things that are going on. And for our staff, it's much the same way. We want our staff to feel comfortable. We want them to feel like they can be a little bit weird. We want them to feel like they can be candid with each other. And depending on the culture and the generation that you live in and the kind of work that you're trying to do, you may make choices in your environment or your workspace that kind of lead to those things. This is just an example. We had one of our employees was just like an amazing doodler. He was kind of an artist, and he would just doodle. And so we would give him this big, huge white wall and these really nice like paint marker things, and he would just spend all night doodling on this wall, and would create this really cool like artistic doodle by the next day. And it just kind of became like a little thumbprint on that campus. It was kind of this unique piece of art that fit with that campus. And we started doing that every time we'd have these little hackathons where all the employees and the students would come in. We'd have kind of this big coding party, essentially, was what it was. And we'd stay up all night, and the students would work on their projects, and we would have little raffles and prizes and stuff to just kind of keep things interesting and exciting. And we made it kind of this tradition that every time we would do one of those, we'd invite an artist in to either paint a wall or do graffiti art or something like that was kind of unique and just kind of added to that, the element of creativity and artistry. So those things are so hard to quantify. Like, how much did that affect the innovation and creativity? It's hard to say, but I can say that everybody who has visited our campuses and has seen what we're doing gets very inspired by the space. They feel like, oh, this is so cool, I want to be a part of it. There's a lot of energy that they feel when they're in the room. And so, again, even though it's hard to put that in kind of quantitative, a format like that, I do think it has a lot to do with your culture of creativity and innovation. Direction. So this was kind of that moment where we sat down and we said, okay, who are we and who do we want to become? And these are the values that we came up with in that setting. So this is kind of like, you have the Zappos company culture and the Netflix company culture. This is kind of the Dev Mountain company culture, at least as it's stated. And I would hope that, just like you said, I would hope that if you walked in to our offices or our classrooms, that you would find these same things in the wild being practiced naturally and not just written on a paper somewhere, to be lost. So you can read all these, but we care. That's kind of espoused in the first one. Students come first. We care about students. We care about the investment they're making in us, just like the investment we're making in them. We try to be humble and teachable. We're all learning together. We don't try to penalize people for not knowing something. We're all learning. So there's no lose points or anything like that if you have to say you don't understand something. We prioritize quality. That's kind of a must-have for our industry, but we have to make sure that the quality is a big part of what we do. Having a bias for action. This is kind of something that this is one of those things that I feel like I espoused early on, but I had to have other people tell me because I couldn't have just vocalized it myself. I really, I loved hiring people that were really talented and then just letting them do their job and just trying to interfere as little as possible. I found that if I just empowered them to do their job and kind of sat back and watched, there might be times where I would give advice, criticism, feedback, whatever, but for the most part they would surprise me and do way more than I would have imagined that they could have done, or maybe that I would have done in their position. So having a bias for action and not being afraid to do something, the kind of people that would come to me early on in their job and say, well, what do you think about this and what do you think about that? And I would just say, look, if it doesn't have a huge risk, just do it. Just try it and see what happens. And again, that whole idea of like failing, right? Like you're probably going to make mistakes, and that's totally fine. But I just want you to learn from this experience, and ultimately I want you to be empowered to do your job. And then give more than you take was kind of this trying to express this idea of like we're all putting in more than we're trying to take out of the company, right? Like this kind of idea of we're all in this for something greater than just a good job and some benefits or something like that. We all feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. So hopefully that kind of captures that a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to quickly jump over constraints. This is my cool ending slide for you. But I'm going to quickly jump over constraints. This is actually an important slide, and I'll just spend like 1 minute on this. The constraints were a really interesting way for us to be creative. And I'll just go over one of them really quickly. So we teach people how to code in 12 weeks. We get them ready to get their first job in web development in 12 weeks. We had zero funding. We didn't raise money from investors or anything like that. So we were always cash strapped, kind of thin line, just trying to keep things going. We were teaching beginners how to code. So we were starting from a very, a pretty baseline of knowledge. And we were operating in the state of Utah, which is an interesting constraint. Because when we started competing nationally and we started trying to get people to come to Utah, we were like, okay, how do we get people to come to Utah, right? If you're from New York or Chicago or San Francisco or something, like what is going to entice you to Utah? And this is where we try to take one of those maybe perceived disadvantages and turn it into an advantage. And we started talking about all the things you could do in Utah, and we would take people on hikes. And it turns out the cost of living is dramatically lower in Utah than it is in places like San Francisco. So we got our students free housing, and that was a part of the, so we tried to turn that disadvantage into a benefit and advantage to our students. And then from a curriculum perspective, that constraint of teaching beginners how to code in 12 weeks forced us into a situation where we had to be just very, very creative from a teaching and learning perspective. We couldn't just kind of rely on people to just pick up on things and give a lecture and just hope that they would come back the next day and having understood it. We had to be much more deliberate with them. We had to put them through a lot more everything from practice examples to projects to assessments that are happening weekly to make sure we know the students are where we expect them to be, and kind of remediation when they're not where they should be. So it was kind of this really interesting environment where we were able to be pretty innovative on our learning model, our teaching model. We utilize a lot of mentors, which you might think of those people as like TAs. We have like a teacher who teaches for 2 or 3 hours a day, but then the rest of the day is really run by these mentors, these teachers' assistants that are helping students. They're doing a lot of the one-on-one help, the coaching, the mentoring, helping them to get through the problems and stuff like that, and that has made a huge difference. So those constraints were actually a big part of helping us to create something that I think was really innovative in this space. And I'm going really fast because we're basically out of time. But what questions can I answer for you in just the minute or two that we have left? I'm so sorry. I wanted to leave a lot more time than this. What questions can I answer for you? Who feels like they have the most important question? I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Good question. So, in your experience, like with the tech industry and then starting your business and stuff, is there anything that you saw that was like common in the cultures you've seen that you think needs to change, or anything like that?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I would say that I've been lucky that I've worked in a lot of places that I've really, really loved. So if anything, I've tried to take the best of what I've learned in every environment and try to carry that forward to the next one that I'm a part of or that I'm building or whatever. I'll just use one example. And so I'm kind of saying on the positive side of this because I can't think of many negative things that were kind of a common thread through all of those, because I think I tried to avoid those just maybe even subconsciously. But one of the ones that I really kind of valued was just this idea of kind of we're all on a level playing field. Like just because I'm the boss or whatever, that doesn't mean that you don't know something that I don't know, and that we can't have a conversation, that you can't teach me something just like I can teach you something, and that kind of striving for at least in kind of a hierarchical structure, striving for some level of like flatness in that structure, even though you have to have managers and you have to have people that are in charge because that's the way that people work. I still think it's so important for you to have a good relationship with the people you work with, and that they feel like they can trust you to be candid and give you feedback just like you give them feedback and criticize. So that's one thing that I've tried to carry forward that I think was really, really important. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely was. I'll say two things to answer that question. Number one is I definitely did not do enough early on to kind of vet people out. I think I just kind of went by my gut, which is, you know, when you're kind of moving that quickly and things are happening fast, sometimes that's just the way it happens. But you know, really vetting people out it's way more important to make a good decision than to try to correct a bad hire, right? And that seems obvious to everybody in this room, but it doesn't always play out that way. Sometimes you get very optimistic about people. You meet them for the first time and you think, this person's great. They've probably got these attributes, even though you don't really know. And so you hire them, and then a few months later, there's some real problems, and you've got to now make a change that's very, very difficult for them and for you. And so it's much better to be more thorough on the front side of that than to try to fix a problem later on. The second thing I'll say is that process of defining culture is actually very helpful in your total hiring process, because as you define your company culture and you say, here's who we are and here's who we aspire to become, those essentially become the basis for your job interview questions, right? If you want your company to be a little bit weird, you're going to ask people questions about what are some weird things that you like to do, right? And obviously you have to stay within HR guidelines and only answer whatever, I don't know. But those core values are going to basically become your interview questions. And so to the extent that you're able to create good interview questions out of those core values and thorough interview questions, so you really feel like you've got a high level of confidence in somebody, I think that's the key. Yeah. Sure.
What if you don't have much choice in sort of who the people are and sort of give it
Like a betrothed marriage type thing?
if you sort of already have people, you don't have as much choice in kind of who they are. It's just sort of strategies once you have people.
And you move into a company or something like that.
Okay. So yeah, then I think that process of sitting down and defining who you are is really, really important. And there may be some real conflict that you have to resolve in those situations. But yeah, I think you've got to sit down and say, okay, who do we as a group want to be? Who are we, and who do we want to become? And you can do that whether whether you were kind of just merged with those people or whether you hired them. I still think it's a really important discussion to have. It's a tricky one though. It's not easy. Good point, or good question.